Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I think our panelists are all here, so I'm delighted to go ahead and introduce them. So this panel is titled The Eaton Scholars, and as I mentioned, we'll be hearing from faculty and recent graduates from UC Riverside and hear a bit about their work and what they've been doing with the Eaton Collection materials and beyond. So thank you all for joining us. So I'll just start with introductions. One of our first panelists is Dr. Jasmine Anne Strickland. They specialize in Black speculative fiction and cultures from the Afro diaspora. She received her PhD in English from UC Riverside in June 2024, and she hails from the south suburbs of Chicago, Illinois. So having received her MA in English at the University of Huntsville in Alabama and BA from Howard University, Jasmine's work focuses on the intersections of race, gender, class consciousness, and critical utopias and applied utopian strategy as it relates to the critical nature of Black speculative fiction's ability to work through trauma. Her current project, titled Disaster and Possibility: Reclaiming Time in Afro-Horror Aesthetics, focuses on the lesser-traveled road of Afro-horror and Afro-surrealism as cathartic tools that crack open past and present experiences of trauma in order to contemplate avenues of resistance against the legacies of white supremacist late capitalist logic while offering therapeutic alterity. In film, literature, and real life, Jasmine's work explores how Black people are often depicted as stereotypically monstrous boogeymen. Afro horror exposes the monstrosity of, quote, civilized society by telling stories from the margins. Jasmine's writing has been published in a variety of presses that are dedicated to conversations around the deeply critical and timely messages of Black speculative cultures. She has published in the Routledge Handbook of Co-Futurisms and Liquid Blacks, the Journal of Blackness and Aesthetics. So welcome, Jasmine. Thank you for joining us. Lovely to see you. Hi.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Our next panelist is Professor Sherryl Vint. Sherryl Vint's research focuses on speculative fiction, especially relationships with science and technology. She works broadly within a Marxist cultural studies tradition. She has published 5 books: Science Fiction, A Guide for the Perplexed, The Wire, Animal Alterity, Bodies of Tomorrow, and with Mark Bald, the Routledge Concise History of Science Fiction. She has also edited or co-edited several volumes and special issues, including most recently Science Fiction and Cultural Theory, a Reader, a special issue of Paradoxa on the futures industry, and most recently, again, After the Human, Culture, Theory, and Criticism in the 21st Century. She has completed 2 books in the last few years: Science Fiction for MIT Press's Essential Knowledge series and Biopolitical Futures in 21st Century Speculative Fiction, which theorizes how speculative fiction interrogates a number of sites where bodies intersect with biotechnology in the marketplace, in areas such as cryonics, transplant surgery, IVF, clinical drug trials, and synthetic biology. Dr. Vint directs the Speculative Fiction and Cultures and Science program of UCR, where she founded the Science Fiction and Technoculture Studies Book Prize. She is an editor of the journal Science Fiction Studies and was previously a founding editor of the journal Science Fiction, Film and Television. She also edits the book series Science and Popular Culture at Palgrave. Great to see you, Sherryl. Thank you for joining us. I believe you're in Europe currently, so extra special thanks. It's a truly international gathering, like I've been saying this whole day. Our next panelist is Professor André Carrington. He's a scholar of race, gender, and genre in Black and American cultural production. He is Associate Professor of English here at UCR, and his first book, Speculative Blackness: The Future of Race in Science Fiction, interrogates the cultural politics of race in the fantastic genres through studies of science fiction fanzines, comics, films, and television, and other speculative fiction texts. He is currently at work on a second book-length research project, or Audio Futurism, on the cultural politics of race in science fiction radio drama and literary adaptation in a transatlantic context. Recently, he is a co-principal investigator in the Mellon Sawyer seminar, Unarchiving Blackness: Why the Primacy of African and African Diaspora Studies Necessitates a Creative Reconsideration of Archives. Carrington's writing appears in journals such as American Literature, Souls, African and Black Diaspora, books such as A Companion to the Harlem Renaissance, Keywords for Comic Studies, and blogs such as Black Perspectives. He is a contributor to digital pedagogies in the humanities and after queer studies, literary theory, and critical interpretation. With cartoonist Jennifer Camper, he co-founded the biennial Queers and Comics International Conference in 2015. He teaches courses on African American and global Black literature, LGBT and queer literature and culture, comics and graphic novels, and science fiction, and is also a birder. Welcome, Andre. Thank you for joining us today. And our final panelist is Dr. Brandy J. Lewis, who is a recent graduate from UCR. Finger snaps for that. Her 2024 dissertation entitled Untaming Fandom, Examine the Literature and Printed Media of Today's Furry Fandom, research produced within and as part of her work with the Fred Patton Collection and fanzine materials here within the Eaton Collection. Her work currently examines speculative fiction and culture as they pertain to transness. So welcome, Brandy, welcome, Dr. Lewis, welcome all you wonderful doctors. As you might realize from these introductions, our panelists have done so much and are such brilliant thinkers and minds, and it's just so great to have you all in one virtual room and hear about your work in science fiction with the Eaton Collection, but also beyond. So I'm going to start with probably a really hard question and a really big question. So feel free to make this as detailed or succinct as you like. Can you talk about one particular research project you carried out using materials from the Eaton Collection specifically? And this is open to the floor. So whoever wants to go first can just jump in. I can use my finger of doom and point to someone. Okay, Jasmine, you go first. You're in my top left.
Sure. So just thinking about a project, I feel like I have multiple projects that I've really used the collections for, but I was especially the collection was especially helpful to me during my reading year at uh, at UCR when I was trying to figure out what the dissertation was going to be. And two volumes that I really enjoyed by Cherie Renee Thomas, which are not they're a little expensive and they're kind of difficult to find. Um, and I think at one point they might have been out of print, but they are back now, are the dark matter anthologies. And so the dark matter anthologies offer like a really wide array of speculative fiction from, the turn of the century, early 1900s, to the millennium. And that really helped me to think about not just science fiction and fantasy fiction, but also horror, and really thinking about the ways in which Afro speculative fiction really uh, defies genre in a lot of ways, and so it's sometimes difficult to place stories in one particular category, right? And that opened up the conversation that I was able to really have in the dissertation project, that is now turning into a book now that I'm a postdoc at USC. So that's one project that I can say it's the biggest project. So that I directly use the Eaton Collection for.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And shout out to Cherie Renee Thomas, amazing editor, writer, thinker. We stand, absolutely. Cheryl, why don't you go next? And you can, if you could talk about a project, recently or otherwise, that you completed with Eaton Collection materials.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to see everyone and welcome to all the attendees I can't see, but it's thrilling to be able to be on a panel with people who've graduated from our program. So that makes me really happy about what we're able to do at UCR. And then quickly, I also want to give credit where credit's due. I'm like notoriously bad about updating websites. So in fact, Dr. Carrington is the current director of the Speculative Fictions and Cultures of Science program, not me. So I just want to give credit where credit's due. And I'm sure, Phoenix, that's my fault because I forget that the online information sphere exists. So apologies for that.
My bad. Apologies.
So All good. So I'm actually going to talk about a project that I did before I was a faculty member at UCR. And I think because that kind of speaks to the place that the Eaton Collection has in the space of people who do scholarship on speculative fiction. So I came and worked here for a summer when I was co-writing with Mark Bold, a history of science fiction. And we spent the summer working in the Eaton archive, and it contributed tremendously to that project, not only because the collection is so vast, so that anything we could think of that we wanted to consult, we could generally find a copy of it in the collection, but particularly for the really early materials, there was something enormously valuable about not simply being able to read the stories from the pulp magazines, but to see them in their original context, how they're situated among editorial letters and advertisements, and that combined with the tremendous fanzine collections that the Eaton holds, as well as a lot of the material objects that the Eaton holds, which I had a delightful opportunity to see exactly how extensive our material object collection is when it was the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, and we pulled like just amazing things I never knew existed, like remote controls for the TV that look like a phaser and things like that we have in our material objects collection. So being able to consult all these things as they were experienced by those who originally read them, whether it's the pulps or people that are involved in fan communities creating their own conversations, especially the letters parts of the pulp magazines. It really helped immerse us in what the conversation was like at the time among people who were starting to articulate what this genre should or could or would be. And I think that otherwise we would lose those elements that are really important to its discursive history and to its socio-political effects, which are a big part of the research that I like to do in the genre. Thanks.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Going anti-clockwise, Brandy, did you want to talk about some of your work?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for putting this panel together. It's great to see people that I haven't seen in quite a few months already, and I miss you all dearly. For my time with the Eaton, I particularly was working with the Fred Patton collection and the fanzine collection. Fred Patton was a historian, was a fan collector, was a big person in terms of the anime community during the mid 20th century, but also within the furry fandom and science fiction communities. And for me, a lot of my work was not just kind of approaching the text that I saw as a fan and trying to change kind of the perspectives that I had, but also kind of realizing what is it that the archive does in terms of allowing certain voices to speak while also, limiting certain conversations. And so just as I was going into the archive, I was also speaking with fans, asking questions, presenting at conferences and conventions. And it really showed me this understanding of the archive as still active. We like to think of the archive as this like box of materials, but as soon as I would leave the archive and talk with fans, they would ask, how do I gain access? What did you see in there? And conversations about the past would come up, either adding to, challenging, or playing off of what I had seen within the materials. And so it was very much an eclectic and even difficult process to try and look at the archive as we think of oftentimes culturally as this arbiter of truth, but then realize, there's so much more there that an archive can't hold. And so throughout the project, it was very much thinking, okay, that's there, but how do I use the literary forms that I see there and contemporary to have a conversation with time, across time, and with different benefactors and contributors within my wider project. I don't spend a lot of time there now. I still have a lot of scans from the Eaton Collection that I hold on to dearly. But every time I talk with fans and tell them of the materials that I've seen, it's always this question of like, how do I get into the stacks, or how do I see these materials? And so I think the Eaton, not just as this holder of history, is also very much still this figure that a lot of people want to see and be a part of, whether academically or otherwise.
Definitely, and yeah, again, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, we do offer a digitization service, but part of the issue, just shout out to that service. But you're absolutely right. And this is a question that I'll ask you all later on is how to make archives and archival research less intimidating and more accessible for folks who might come from academic communities, who might come from outside of academic communities. And I love what you said, Brandy, about living archives, right? The physical communities, the present communities that are archiving themselves, whether they might realize or not. And that ongoing work. So thank you. Those are great points you brought up. And Andre, turning over to you, if you wanted to share an example of a project that you've worked on recently with Eaton Materials.
Sure, thank you. And thank you again for putting together this wonderful program. Like Sherryl, my own work with the Eaton Collection goes back to before I was a faculty member at UC Riverside. I think maybe in 2007 or 2008, when I was doing my doctoral dissertation, I used the Eaton Collection to find material in fanzines that I had just heard about. And it was a really formative experience for me and ended up forming the basis for part of my first book. Now, more recently, I sourced some stories for a fiction anthology that I edited this past year of Black speculative fiction from like the past 10 or 20 years called The Black Fantastic. It'll be on shelves. It's like in the world soon. And I really could access it because I could access a range of stories from recent history, a blend of things that have been published online, which is the tendency for most new material, but also things that had been in print from well-known authors and from lesser-known authors to include them because we had them in the Eaton. And while I was putting it together and looking for material, there's a story by Tara Campbell that was only published in a really expensive, large hardcover Black sci-fi short story collection that would be hard for a lot of readers to get. But because our collection specialized in material like that, we had it and I could scan it and share it with the publisher. I also found a very, very short story by Nello Hopkinson, whose materials we have. A story that had originated as an exercise in a writing workshop that she included in an anthology of her fiction. And I also went to the Eaton and requested collections of fiction by Kini Aburasalam and Craig Gidney and Sophia Samatar. And really just the ease of access and the sense that we had a good account of not just what's the most popular recent and contemporary fiction, but that because the collection has had a really good habit of being in touch with current writers, whether their careers have taken off and they've won prizes, or whether they're just appearing on the radar, making it a priority to collect that material has really, I think, helped the Eaton play a role in advancing the popularization and hopefully, broader readership for some of these Black authors of science fiction and fantasy. I also go to the Eaton all the time to request material and to obtain scans of original publications of things for my classes so that I can show students what the material we're reading looks like, even if they're going to be using a PDF version of it, or it's been republished in a book, or has been available online in a source book. I like being able to show them that, it appeared in this magazine, this is the table of contents, this is what it looked like when it was first published, and we can really have that sense of connecting with the material in its original format.
Definitely. And yeah, I put the link for the book in the chat, and the table of contents is completely stacked. So I'm so excited for it. And thank you for your work. And just on that point, I guess if we pivot towards teaching with special collections materials, and we can think beyond the Eaton Collection now and just in general, what are some challenges or some strategies of invitation to bring younger scholars in, or folks who might not be experienced with working with special collections materials, or even challenges you face in your own work? What are some of the ways that you've mediated that journey into special collections and work with special collections materials? And I can finger of fortune, we'll point to someone, or anybody can jump in Andre, let's start with you this time.
I'll start this time.
Yeah.
So when I teach the graduate seminar on speculative fiction in English, that is open to other students. English grad students sign up, students from Comp Lit, students from Hispanic Studies have taken it, students in anthropology have taken it, and an MFA student has taken it also. We really focus on using the resources of special collections and the Eaton specifically, really as a formative step in bridging the process of going from doing original work in writing seminar papers and writing analytically in an English grad seminar about literature and doing original research and understanding what it means to use archival methods and historical sources to understand literature and culture. So some of the things that we do in that course are we read about the nature of special collections and archives. We read about the history of special collections at UCR. We look at some material that comes from and draws on these collections. And we also read some publications from library science and book history that put in perspective why it's valuable to see things in different formats. We look at like theories and the nature of documents and things like that. And I think it leads students to appreciate the resources that are available to them right here. The challenge is always how to start. The challenge is always sort of what kind of question to ask and what kind of evidence is even available to form questions around. And that exploratory process is really exciting, but still really painstaking and difficult for every graduate student and for me still when I'm coming up with investigations and I'm trying to figure out how I can answer questions that come up in my own research. What's really generative about going through that, though, is that students have one-on-one conversations with librarians like Phoenix and Andy and Sandy and Robin Katz. And we, I think, develop a really good appreciation for the work that our colleagues in the world of libraries and archives do, and understand how we play such an important and different role in knowledge production, how we take care of what's been published and what's been collected and preserved, and how we put our findings out into the world for other scholars to draw on. I can say really every seminar paper that students do in a grad course like that, it's really a growth process for them. And it really gives them, I hope, a sense of, what they can do in the future, how they might return to that particular collection and do work on science fiction and fantasy, or how they might take those skills and apply them somewhere else, how they might take, what they learn from documents in one location and think, I would rather address these questions through oral history, or how they observe certain things in our collections and read fanzines or correspondence and say, I'm going to do ethnographic interviews. I'm going to supplement this knowledge of the past with some present and contemporary things. So it's really valuable beyond the actual research query and endeavor itself.
Amazing. And I'm glad you, and thank you for mentioning that sort of collaborative process in a way, because I mean, it's for someone like me, working with scholars at the top of their field, I learn from you just as much as I can help you, if that makes sense. So for instance, I know you'll have recommended titles for me to buy, or Andre specifically, and if there's scholarship that's coming out or it's at the forefront, we can purchase things for the Eaton Collection. And likewise for attendees, if your institutions or even your public libraries, if there are authors that you're passionate about or a particular title that you might want, feel free to reach out to librarians. We work for you really to bring this material to light and to readers. So thank you for that. Let's go reverse order. Brandy, what are some of the strategies that you use for your teaching or research in terms of using collections, special collections materials?
Yeah, so for me, I've taught science fiction materials in both composition courses, as well as this last fall, I taught a science fiction course at Cal State Los Angeles. And I definitely picked and pulled materials from the archive, whether scans or reproductions of, let's say, for instance, essays by Gernsback. And a lot of the time, I pulled on students already held attachments in some ways to science fiction, fantasy, and speculative fiction to get them to be curious about what is in the archive. But I've also had to work with students to think about the ways in which, we think of history as a chronology because of Western structures of temporality. And so students sometimes will think, well, that was all the way in the past, and I don't like that material. When in actuality, there are resonances between the past and the present. And so I'll talk with students, well, what do you think of Gernsback's essay on science fiction and what he was trying to produce? How does that sound similar to something that we've looked at today? And I've had students actually take their own experience into the archive and look at materials, whether that's manga, anime, science fiction, fantasy, and try to compare what they know of today with the past. And that's really lucrative for me as an instructor, because then we get to those open questions. What was happening at the time? How were people talking about these texts, these genres? And in what ways maybe are they different or shifting? And so in this last class, we looked at Gernsback's essay on scientific fiction, but then we also look at W.E.B. Du Bois's The Comet, thinking about how the comet had scientific fiction aspects of it within it, and yet it wasn't included, or it was overlooked as Gernsback was thinking to older figures of perhaps scientific fiction. And so I think using kind of the knowledge students already have of the genre can be useful, but it's also that like conversational process of like, time is messier. And so we can see aspects of what we know today in the past, just as we could see aspects of the past in today.
Beautifully put. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Sherryl, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So I've mostly used the Eaton Collection in teaching my undergraduate classes. And one of the challenges there is really the size of our undergraduate classes are very big. So sort of actually physically going to the Eaton can be a challenge for the space, because they will be, 75, 100, 125 students. But I will say, echoing things that both Brandy and Andre have said, that the amazing collaborative approach of Eaton librarians and other library staff has made it really possible to be able to integrate that experience even with very large classes. I've done things like had people come to the class to give presentations, but also I've been accommodated in having multiple visits of smaller groups of that class to come to the Eaton and see a curated collection of items that have been pulled out that relate to things that we're studying in the class. And one of the reasons I like to do the latter is because I do think that that kind of breaks potentially a barrier students feel about entering a space like special collections, that maybe they feel it's not for them. And so to have an invitation to go there and have an exhibit that's pulled out specifically for you and what you're studying, I think makes it feel like a more accessible space. And there's also something about, I don't know if I would fully want to call it an aura, but there's something about the objects themselves, their materiality, that I think students can connect to when you're in the presence of the objects and you see, how they've been used by other readers, or how, one of the exhibits I've done is multiple covers of the same book, that it can open up a conversation for us about how a certain text is being differently positioned at different moments in history. So some of those really like haptic, physical elements of the collection can be appreciated when you're able to bring classes into the space. And then the other way that the Eaton has really been important to some of the teaching and mentoring I've done is I've hosted multiple graduate students from all across the world, really, who want to come to UCR because the Eaton Collection is there and they want to do research in it. And again, here I just really have to praise the collaborative approach that we have with Phoenix and other people who've been in the Eaton librarian position, and other staff who in the library that are working around special collections in general and the Eaton specifically. that they're not simply providing access to materials, but serving as real research partners, suggesting other related materials that we might want to look at that we haven't thought of ourselves, and providing digitization services to help people when they have only a short stay be able to accumulate the data that they can take home and study more at their leisure. Being in dialogue with people before they arrive in the US so that they can make the most of their research time. So it's really a combination of the resource itself, but also the expertise of all the people who support and nurture and build that collection, who enable it to be this site for amazing research production in pedagogical senses.
Oh, thank you. And it's it's been such a pleasure getting to work with your students. Postdocs have come in. We in all sorts of disciplines, MFA students, literature students. And if attendees, you take anything away from this is that academics and librarians are not scary. You can email us, you can ask us questions. We are happy to talk about our research and our work. So thank you. Thank you, Sherryl. Jasmine, over to you.
So, I haven't had a whole lot of experience in terms of uh, bringing my students while at UCR, bringing my students to the Eaton Collection. We were able to work with N.K. Jemison's The Fifth Season in one of the composition courses, and it's a favorite to teach. So I always, at the time, I recommended my students head over to the Eaton Collection to um, see also other works by N.K. Jemisin, and if they were still interested in her work. And that's been my experience. Currently, I'm about to embark on teaching a course at USC that prioritizes and focuses on Black utopian fiction and fantasy. And I'm struck by my experience with the Eden Collection and reading Charles Saunders' Imaro, which, has been in and out of print. And it also, again, uh, uh, access, right? And so I was able to have access to that book via the Eaton Collection during my time at UCR, and I'm bringing conversations around utopian construction and fantasy, African and Afro futurisms, right? So I'm bringing all those conversations to play in this course that I'm teaching. And if I did not have access to the Eaton Collection, I may not have been inspired to construct a course or design a course like this. And when I do start teaching, I will, of course, promote the Eaton Collection for my students. Just, we're in Southern California, so hey, go ahead, head on to UCR. We're talking about Black fantasy fiction. These resources are held in this large and really splendid archive, right? So go ahead, travel, take a walk down the road, right? So to speak. But that's really been my experience. I have pointed students in the direction of the Eaton Collection, especially for those who are interested in Black speculative fiction, but they may not have all the resources to purchase these creative works outright. It can get really pricey. We've all added to our personal libraries, and that's just as academics, and it's expensive. And so my goal is to always point students in the direction of materials that are available to them through their tuition,
That part.
and yeah, and go from there, right? But that's been my experience.
Thank you so much. And this symposium is not sponsored, I promise you, but we so appreciate the celebration of the Eaton Collection, of course. I guess I'll go on to another question, thinking broadly about your scholarship and its relation to fandom communities. We talked on an earlier panel about the sort of mainstreamization of science fiction media in general. So for instance, folks may have gone to Comic-Con, but they may never have gone to ReaderCon or ICFA or any of these other kind of satellite conferences or meeting spaces that are centered on speculative fiction more broadly. And this is just an invitation to you all to talk about your relationship to fandom, right? Maybe even in academic communities, but also beyond, fans, writers, other creatives. If you could speak a little bit about that and how it informs your work or otherwise. And I can pick on someone again. We can start with, Jasmine, go.
So, I am very excited for DreamCon that's happening in Houston 2025. Uh, I don't know if everyone is familiar with this group of folks called RDC World, and they have a bunch of social media shorts, comedic usually, but it's Black folk participating in fandom cultures, especially in anime and comic book cultures, and they create skits um, around a- around their love for these cultures, right? These fandoms, and I think it's grown in popularity recently, and really an amazing sort of convention to attend if you're not really aware um, of just the ways in which Black folks are participating in speculative cultures. So I have not attended. I'm going to attend in Houston, but I'm really looking forward to that. Um, and just seeing the broadening of certain capacities, especially as we're opening up conversations around, well, how do Black folks participate in fantasy? How do Black folks participate in anime cultures, especially as they're seen to prioritize predominantly homogenous like Japanese cultures as well as uh, uh, white fandoms, right? And so just a really interesting take on the relationship between Black folks and fandom.
Awesome. That sounds so much fun. I think I've shared the correct link. And what was the name of the group you mentioned, Jasmine, who do the skits?
RDC World, I think.
RDC. Okay, me RDC World. Just want to make sure I'm putting the right.
Have
Oh,
my
is it
phone out on
YouTube
it.
channel?
Yes. And I'm
Okay,
looking on
perfect.
Instagram too. Make sure
Yeah,
I'm right. But yeah.
perfect. Yeah, please do feel free to drop links in the chat to everyone so
Okay.
folks can see these things. That's great. Thank you. Brandy, you can go next.
So could you remind me of the question again?
Absolutely. So just speaking about your fandom communities and how they've informed or in conversation with your academic work. And is there indeed a separation? Is there has it informed your scholarship? How do you participate in conferences? That kind of thing.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that, just it structured because of the discourse of fandom as we understood it earlier prior to the 21st century. Um, there was this believed separation between fandom and academia, but like folks like Matt Hills and other scholars really challenged that there are academic repertoires within fandom, just as there are fan repertoires within academia. And a lot of when I was doing my dissertation on the furry fandom and producing my article, which is currently being under review, a lot of times I would speak with fans on what are your thoughts on these materials? What do you think about these stories we've heard told from a certain perspective? So furries are often thought of as highly sexualized fans, or fans who are at the bottom of the cream of the crop in comparison to more capitalistic ventures like gaming and cosplay and whatever is more acceptable to dominant culture. And a lot of the time, fans would either add to or bring a different perspective that was informed by their own personal experiences that get shut out even by fans who are trying to tell stories about their fandom in a better light. And so I think doing this work is very much a dialectical process, and kind of realizing, there are much more nuances to the stories we like to hold onto. And I think I wouldn't be where I'm at without fandom or fans, giving their voice to the project itself. But also, you know, we kind of enter academic spaces, particularly around science fiction, because of our own fan interests. And so I think definitely fandom bleeds into academia and back and forth. And I can't watch something academically without trying to like find places where I could be a fan of it. So I'm thinking in terms of like Squid Games or Wicked, like what are my attachments to these texts, and how do those attachments bring a different perspective?
Definitely. I'm going to pin a question that you just raised, and this came up again in an earlier panel of enjoyment versus work or labor in a field, right, such as this. So thank you for bringing that up. Andre, can you speak a bit about your relationship with your scholarship, editorial work, creative work, and fandom communities?
Sure. It's I was really invested in bridging fandom and scholarship in my first book, and really in my whole path to doing work in science fiction studies and comic studies, especially because it's really fan communities that have been the keepers of the history of these cultures. And something important for me has always been kind of comprehending a kind of a disciplinary a seeming impasse that I think isn't really an impasse. It's kind of a mirage between sort of drawing on and learning from fans and fan communities as a contemporary source of like ethnographic knowledge. And on the other hand, learning from fans and fan communities as, you know, historically discontinuous but persistent knowledge producers, right? People who in one generation to the next, in one format to the next, produce culture of their own for their own reasons, and also shape the sort of mass media apparatus that tries to satisfy the audience's demand. And really walking in that space in between, sort of learning from what people have done in the past and what, you know, the reception of different forms of media have meant in different contexts to different people. Walking in those spaces as, you know, a member of a contemporary audience and a fan of the things happening in my own lifetime, and a scholar who's trying to investigate how people who are positioned like me and unlike me at other moments and other places relate to the kinds of narratives and images that they produce and consume. It's been a really generative position to take as a scholar. I think especially for science fiction and comics critics in particular, just the notion that we should be reflexive about our relationship to fan culture is, I think, something really valuable and something that makes our variety of academic practice useful and exciting and generative in ways that it really wouldn't be if we assumed that a distant or a dispassionate relationship to the media and the knowledge production that we study and write about, if we assumed it should be distant. I find it's really exciting to know people who make comics and to position myself as a scholar in kind of the same way I position myself as a fan, which is to say, I don't do this, I can't do it, y'all got it, you know how it's done, and I have a lot to learn from you. And I view part of what I do as less like explaining, you know, ideology and history and different sort of discursive models and theories to practitioners, and more explaining what I learned from engaging with the media that I study and I'm a fan of, what I learned that teaches us in intellectual spaces and institutions about how culture actually works, and what kinds of questions we can ask. Mainly, I think my relationship to fandom is a really privileged one because I've access to like generations of fanzines and databases that have digitized versions of things that other people might only have a partial glimpse of where they're situated. So it's really exciting. In a way, being a scholar allows me to be kind of a super fan.
Thank you. And I love that what's emerging from this conversation is sort of the idea of decentering knowledge production, or making it that dialectical relationship that you mentioned, Brandy. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Andre. And Sherryl, just if you could say a few words about your work in the community, in fandom.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to echo some of the things that are said already. In the work that I've published, I haven't really worked centrally on fandom, but I absolutely endorse the things that have been said already, especially about decentering knowledge production and thinking about ways that many of the concepts and vocabulary that were foundational to the sort of emergence of science fiction as an academic discipline, those terms were first created in fanzines and other kinds of newsletters. So that I think that this is something that's really unique about science fiction as a genre, is that it's always had people who were engaged passionately with studying it, as well as creating it, as well as otherwise imaginatively engaging with the tools that it provides. And recently, a lot of the work I'm doing has really been about, I think you used the term earlier, Phoenix, about a kind of mainstreaming of science fiction. And the way that I'm thinking about this and the work that I'm doing is really that science fiction has become this really important rhetorical mode in 21st century culture. And sometimes that's to the good, but unfortunately, sometimes that's also reinforcing the sort of toxic blow-ups we see in some fandom cultures that relate to some of the other political polarizations that we see. And I think there's also a kind of technocratic imagination that's being highly cultivated by Silicon Valley tech billionaires that draws heavily from science fiction, but sort of belies its origins in science fiction at times. And then there's these, fights over what really counts as science fiction, or whose vision can really count as science fiction, that have sometimes been quite toxic in fandom communities, like the infamous race fail or the puppies incident, or yes, that we're all living in the torment nexus. And if only people had listened to science fiction producers and scholars, maybe we wouldn't be living in the torment nexus, or maybe we would have been living in it sooner. I don't know. But all of which is to say that I think that that all of this way that science fiction has become such an important discursive mode in contemporary culture really speaks to the power of fandoms and how communities cohere around texts in these ways that Andre was also talking about. And one of the things that I like to do with that in terms of teaching at UCR is, because we have this great collection of fanzines, that one of the things I'm always showing students is that these arguments are there from the very beginning. Fandom is schisming from the very beginning. And so I like to teach them about Michelism and about the Science Fiction League, and about ways that even though there are these sort of very influential voices claiming only their kind of science fiction can count as science fiction, there's always people doing other things and showing that the term is more capacious or differently capacious. And so I think that struggle is a very interesting thing to both study, but also to be in dialogue with the contemporary versions of it. And what I, as a scholar, can bring to those conversations is a sense of that history, I think, in the ways that Andre is suggesting, that not everyone has access to being able to know. People fought these battles in the newsletters of the 1940s. In fact, that was my favorite part of the research for the science fiction history book, was reading these back and forth jabs at one another that were happening in letters pages or in the fanzines, and just like you started to take sides in these fights, or I found myself doing that as I'm reading them. These things really came alive. And then I think something like one of our really important fan studies scholars, Henry Jenkins, his most recent work is founding what he calls the Civic Imagination Project. And I think that also really speaks to how these fan strategies of taking media texts and turning them into something that speaks to what the community needs, they cultivate a skill set that can also be used in a wider set of political engagements. And I think that kind of work is extremely important. And so those sort of real world spaces of the science fiction imaginary that have their origin in fan communities is one of the things I'm interested in thinking with and through right now.
Amazing, definitely. Yeah, I was trying to describe the spaces of fanzines to undergraduate students and graduate students as sort of Reddit before Reddit existed, right? And entire careers have been launched of people being mad at each other. One example I can think of is I think one of the editions of The World of Null A by A.E. Van Vogt has an introduction by the author talking about how Damon Knight was so mad at him for writing what he thought was such a crap novel that he wrote a letter, I can't remember, to the publication, and then was inspired to go on and become a novelist himself. And you see the same with Octavia Butler, famously, who she watched that terrible movie, can't remember the name, and she was like, well, I could do this. So absolutely. That's so, yeah, that's so illuminating. Thank you for sharing that. We have about 9 minutes left, so I want to make sure if there are any attendees, we have a lot of them. If there are any questions, Devil Girl from Mars, amazing, thank you. We have Carla Nielsen from Huntington. Hi, Carla. Go check out Octavia Butler's papers. Amazing, amazing archive. If there are any questions in the chat for our panelists, I have a feeling we could talk for hours, honestly. So do pop them in the chat or in the Q&A function. But I wanted to ask a quick moment about that question of enjoyment versus labor, right? We're fans and scholars of the work in ways that maybe other fields are not. It's not quite as pronounced, maybe. That's slightly hot take. And Brandy, you were mentioning, when you watch a text, for lack of a better term, like Wicked or Star Trek or whatever, is there an aha moment that switches the approach to it from I'm just enjoying this as a fan to, oh, there's a question I want to drill deep into? And we can start with you, Brandy, if you feel comfortable talking about that moment where the enjoyment not switches off, but it shifts gear to a separate academic question.
Yeah,
related.
So thank you for that question. Recently, I just started watching both Skeleton Crew from Disney Plus with Star Wars, but also Squid Game season 2. And as I'm watching, I'm always trying to connect, where does this text get in conversation with something I've read or enjoyed? And so Skeleton Crew, it's pulling from the Goonies and other 1980s films, whereas Squid Games, it has a lot of dystopian traces in it, even though it's present day South Korea. And as I'm watching it, it's just kind of putting the work together, putting the text together, where, at some point I start to think more perhaps than I want to when I'm watching media. And it's always that question, do I turn that part of my brain off, or do I let it do its thing? Or do I come back to it later? And so, thinking with Squid Games and the dystopia, and how science fiction, as Sherryl points out, is this really rhetorical tool right now to think about our present moment. It's how do I not, enjoy a text as a fan without thinking about these aspects, particularly with science fiction? It's just, as part of a viewer, I just have to stop and say, okay, am I wanting to do this work now, or am I just going to enjoy this and then I can always come back to it later?
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. And anybody else on the panel can jump in. Yeah, Sherryl.
I'll jump in quickly, which is to say, I mean, maybe I'm just sort of so fully a geek that I don't sort of thinking and enjoyment kind of go together for me quite a bit. But the one thing I would say about that question of enjoyment that I have to fight against in myself, so I don't know if other people also have this experience, but there's a real risk in this is subversive and politically important because I like it kind of thinking. And so I think that's the problem, is that you always have to have your enjoyment, but then also be honest with yourself and asking critical questions, because there's a tendency to want to justify the text you enjoy as being perhaps more subversive or more politically engaged than they sometimes are, because you yourself like them and you want to make them align with the things you think. So I know that's a difficulty I struggle with myself.
Thanks for sharing. I have a shuddering recollection of me writing about Pokemon in an undergraduate essay class on ideology, and I think I did a good job, but then in hindsight I was like, oh no, it was precisely that, I probably could have chosen something different. I don't know. Thank you for sharing that. Andre, Jasmine, if you wanted to jump in that question. Yeah, Jasmine.
I always think my eldest brother, who has been my long-term like book club companion, we, since started reading, he always says to me now, like, Jasmine, do you hate fun? Because because of what I do. He's a huge speculative fiction nerd, and so it's like, but that's what makes it interesting or fun, or addressing the questions that arise in the text, now that you have these lenses to see them or view them differently, or pay more of a focused attention. But as Brandy has said, I operate as a fan first, and that's what leads my intuition towards text. And I see there's a question in the
Mm-hmm.
chat about the difficulties, and I'll segue into that, the
Mm-hmm.
difficulties of researching contemporary trends and movements in SFF as they unfold versus those of the past where hindsight is available.
Great
Because
question.
yeah, really. And my work is like very, very contemporary. Like as I'm writing, things that have come out within like the last like handful of years, but both film and novels. I see it as just kind of this very scary moment in which it's like, oh, there's nothing out here to help me kind of to inform necessarily the conversation, because no one has written on it yet. But then also I think of these projects that are arising as a especially in Afro horror, as a continuity of time. And so when I read something like Jordan Peele's anthology Out There Screaming, I can also think about Ida B. Wells's work on the terror of lynching, right? Or Nia DaCosta's directed Candyman, right? I can think about older texts historically that inform our relationship with these products, these creative projects that are coming out, and how we can read them without necessarily having some other, or at least for me as an academic, I can read this without having someone else who has already spoken about it, or created a conversation around it, since I am the person who's now creating the conversation, or partaking in it as other people are partaking in it in the present, right? So that's the way that I address those difficulties, is thinking about it as, not an isolated historical moment or a particular project, but something that is related to things that have happened in the past, in the present, and may again occur in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I've dropped the link to the book, the anthology you mentioned in the chat. It's really wonderful. We have 1 minute left. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Are there any final thoughts, things you'd like to plug, parting comments? And I'm opening it up to all of you.
I'm just delighted to be teaching history of science fiction undergrad class now with over 100 students in it, and no, I had an intro science fiction class with over 100 students and a history of science fiction class with about 30 students in it right now. And they're both like, the challenge of teaching them is really that there's so much to work with here at UCR, and figuring out it's really possible to give them the best introduction to this material and the most history of science fiction with this material. And that's a real challenge and a privilege. So I look forward to seeing all these future Eaton scholars come out of those courses.
Definitely, and it's no greater pleasure than for me as a librarian, sort of doing an outreach event, and a student saying, "Oh my God, I didn't know this was here, this whole collection." So yes, I'm excited. I'm so excited for both the scholarship that's been carried out, and as you said, the future scholars here. Well, we are at time, so I just want to thank you all again so much, Jasmine, Sherryl, Brandy, Andre, for taking the time to talk about your work today. It's been so great hearing from you all. Thank you to all our attendees. We've had a lot. This is one of the biggest events I think the library's done online in recent history, so that's fantastic to see. Thank you all for showing up. We're going to take a break for lunch, so I'm going to end the webinar completely, so don't be scared if you'll get booted off, but I will restart it at 1:30 with the same, you can rejoin with the same link that you've used so far. And we're going to pivot to talking to current editors, authors in the field to hear about the state of the field of science fiction publishing. Speaking of a contemporary moment, per the question in the chat. So thank you everyone again so much. Have a great rest of your day or evening, and I will see you at 1:30 Pacific time.